All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We are coming to the end of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. We are into Parashat Bechukotai. And there are a number of very beautiful and poetic expressions of observing the commandments, which we're not going to look at today. We're instead going to look at something which may seem completely irrelevant, which is how we handle the concept of the value of a human life.
Good.
Good. Okay.
I was very confused by this portion.
It does seem a little unusual.
It's very confusing.
If I were to ask you what price could you put on a human life, what would you say?
I don't think you could put a price on it.
You can't put a price on a human life, right?
No.
I mean, if I were to say, how much money would you demand from me to let me kill you?
Oh, wow.
You would say, no, right? No, there's no price that you can put on me taking your life, okay? But how much money would you demand to give up your right hand? $1 million? And I can cut off your right hand? $1 billion? $100 billion? And you'd still say, I want my hand? You know how many prosthetic hands you could buy for $100 billion?
$2 million, the loss of a limb.
Right? Or let's take it from the other way. Let's imagine someone did cut off your hand and you're now in court. How much would you expect the court to compensate you? Let me just double check that's not a technical problem. We're okay. How much would you expect the person who cut off your hand in an accident or some other form of a problem, how much would you expect the court to award you for the damage of what you have lost?
For the loss of productivity.
For the loss of your productivity. So the hand of a famous artist or of a sculptor is worth more than the hand of somebody who is a supermarket clerk?
Well, perhaps this is like.
Or the hand of a 20-year-old is worth more than yours.
Because, you know,
Yeah.
Because they
my
have
hand's
a
almost
lifetime of earnings, productivity.
and my hand's almost worn out anyway, so you know it's already getting those little twinges and such. So do we say about the size of the hand, right? What about a life? Right? You're in a traffic accident. Some fool runs a red light, slams into your car, and kills a loved one. Right? You now in court. How much are you expecting to receive in compensation for that loss?
Well, many millions, I imagine.
But can
That's
you?
what they're awarding.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
and sometimes not. If the person who was killed was the primary breadwinner for the family, and now she's gone and you're left to take care of the kids, do you expect to get more than if that person was the elderly aunt in the family who had no children and no one dependent upon them?
Well, they don't take all that into consideration when they're making these decisions.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, they do,
They do.
in court.
At least in American law, they do.
And that comes out of English law, and it goes back to King Alfred the Great and the system of the weregeld, which was assessing different values depending on the age and your status of birth.
So every society, even as distasteful as it may seem, has had to try and wrestle with the question of how do we value a life when we have to value a life. What's unusual in this week's Torah portion is you get to put a value on a life without taking it, right? We're not talking about loss of life in this section. We're going to be talking about someone who wishes to make a dedicatory vow to the temple or to the Mishkan, the tabernacle at this time, where they would like to donate a fixed value based upon the value of a life. And then, of course, we have to figure out, well, if you say, I want to donate the value of his life, how much is he worth? How much is my vow then going to come as what price tag will be put on my vow? If I don't make a vow for 5,000, but I say a vow for his life, my life, your life, someone has to stick a price tag on that in order to know how much my vow is and therefore how much I must actually do to fulfill my vow. That's what we're dealing with. All right, so let's get some Torah on the table, and then we'll begin to see how our commentators have wrestled with the unusual phrasing in this section. We good? Good. So we are on chapter 27, which is page 753, if you are in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, and we're beginning at verse number 1. Would you mind?
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, When anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent for a human being, the following scale shall apply. If it is a male from 20 to 60 years of age, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight. If it is a female, the equivalent is 30 shekels. If the age is from 5 years to 20 years, the equivalent is 20 shekels for a male and 10 shekels for a female. If the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels of silver, and the equivalent for a female is 3 shekels of silver. If the age is 60 years or over, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male, and 10 shekels for a female. But if one cannot afford the equivalent, he shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess him. The priest shall assess him according to what the vower can afford.
Okay, so how does this work? So I want to make a vow, and I want to make a vow for somebody, sorry, this is the age column. And I want to make a vow for somebody who is 25 years old and is a male. How much is my vow worth? 50, right?
50
Just
shekels.
follow the graph, right? Follow the chart. 50 shekels. And if it was for a woman, it would be 30 shekels. All right. So who would like to be outraged that we're valuing women less than we're valuing men?
Well, I'm a bit outraged.
Okay, good.
But I've read it many times.
Okay.
Because all the male does is the breadwinner. That's all he does.
Because the women don't win bread?
They
Not that
work,
time.
Really?
No, they naked.
they work, and they have the babies, and
Right.
they're working. Our job is much more than this silly man.
Okay, so
It is, it really and truly is. We have a lot to do.
so what are these numbers based on? Right?
Well, the male's made.
What's that?
The male's made.
Because the male is well, but remember though, the numbers that we're talking about here are not meant to be telling you how much you are worth. Right? The numbers here are not your fair market value, if you will. The numbers here are to tell you what a category of a person is worth if you're making a vow using them as the benchmark of your vow. Right? If someone wants to donate 50 shekels in honor of their mother, who's 45 years old, they can donate 50 shekels in honor of their mother. It's only if they say, I want to donate the value of my mother, and meaning she will be the benchmark, that we get to 30. So nothing about this system precludes a person from valuing another person, meaning how much they mean to them, as much as they want, right? As we began when we first said how much is the value of a human life, there is no value, right? The person is infinitely important to me. The person is infinitely dear to me. But if you want to use a generic marker by mentioning a person and turn that into a specific figure, this is the chart the Torah says we use. So let's just make sure we get this very, very clear, because a lot of people do use this both either to attack the Torah as being chauvinist or to justify their own chauvinism.
On the other side, it in some way it's encouraging the giver to give for your children by making that easier.
I mean, because it's cheaper.
It's cheaper, but that's an encouragement. And there's also the provision that if you can't afford the full amount, you go to the priest and say,
Right.
This is what I have, this is our income.
Right. All of it can be adjusted.
So there's those adjustments. But it seems like it would encourage that donation for your children.
Right.
So this is,
Maybe this is like recommended numbers.
It's in fact not recommended. They are fixed. Right. Well, fixed is very important, right? Again, a person can make a vow of any amount they want. This is saying if the statement you made was without a number, but was referencing another person, then this is how we will assess that value. And
What's 50?
What's that?
What's 50 or 30?
50 or 30 if you're between 20 and 60. And if it was the 1 month old baby, it's 5. If it's a girl, it's 3. Right? That you would just give that as, this is how much I vowed. right? This is how much is expected for me to complete my vow, wherein I mentioned the specific identity of a person who falls somewhere into this category. Does that make sense? This does not mean men 20 to 60 are worth more to society. Right? This is not saying that at all. This is not saying that babies that are 5 months old and or 5 years old and female are the least valuable thing in the community. It's not trying to say that's how we value them. And in fact, we know that because there are other ways to value people. And this is where the word value is so slippery. Right? In the ancient world, let me just double check, it's not something about the, what was the way that you would, on average, you would use to value a person? It's a distasteful topic these days.
Slave market.
Slave market, right? Slave market. People were putting price tags on other human beings all the time, right? And they priced them on the individual level, right? So if this guy looked like he was more valuable, he had a higher price tag. Didn't matter where he was on the chart, right? A 19-year-old could easily fetch a higher price than a 55-year-old if you were up on the slave block. And likewise, a woman might fetch more than a man, depending upon her skills, depending upon what she'd be doing. Now, this may not have been the full chattel slavery that eventually came into the United States, but it still does provide the idea that the ancients knew of ways to value people individually. They knew what it was to put a price tag on another person's life, because unfortunately that was just standard practice throughout the entirety of the ancient world around the globe. Right? Every society that has ever reached more than a hunter-gatherer level, and even many of those, has introduced some form of valuation of another person as being indentured servant or some form of long-term bondsman to another person for money. And it is not this system, right? This system, well, imagine you were selling cars, right? If you were going to sell cars, is this how you price your cars? Right, you've got the Honda column and you got the Ford column, or wait, Mazda column and the Ford column, right? And then it's just how old the car is, and that's how you price it. Is that how you price a car? No. What's that?
Mileage.
Mileage, yeah, but the mileage of a Ford that is from 2002 and the mileage of a Ford from 2018, if it's the same mileage, is the car the same price? No. Of course not. Which car is it? Right? Maybe it's one of the fancy ones. Maybe it's one of the cheap ones. Right? We would value it on the individual car base. This is not doing it individually. If you did this for your business, you'd go broke. And that means we need to figure out why the Torah is giving us something that makes no sense from how the society actually values individual people when it's trying to come up with how we measure. Trying to see which stack has more and fewer. Okay, and we're on the front side that begins with the phrase, the Torah did not want.
The Torah did not want human beings to be valued individually like horses or donkeys.
Okay, so wait, so what? Straight off the bat, Abarbanel is telling us, you don't treat people like animals. I guess a horse, you would value it individually, right? You'd look in its mouth and count its teeth and see how healthy it was, unless it's a gift horse. You check its feet, you check its, how healthy it is, and whether you can see the ribs and all the other things you do before you buy an animal. Absolutely. But for this, that's not how the person is going to be evaluated. You don't get grandma out there and say, okay, well, what kind of grandma is she? What caliber is she? What's she worth? And say, okay, she's a female, she's over 60, 10, done. Right? This is not a business model, which is what Abarbanel is trying to tell us. Although he does give us an interesting insight into how the math doesn't quite flow evenly.
One would expect a woman's worth would be half the man's. But since she is capable of bearing children at this stage of life, her worth is boosted by 5 shekels.
Okay, so there's a couple of unusual numbers that the Barbanel is beginning to draw our attention to. One of them is at the 5 to 20 line, right? It is exactly a 50% between men and women, right? And you would expect then, if that's the pattern, that would continue, that it should also be 50% here. But of course, 50% of 50 would be 25, and it's not, it's 30. So a Barbanel is saying +5 because she can get pregnant now.
But that doesn't make sense with the other, with 1 month to 5 years and over 60. That logic doesn't apply there.
But then we get down to here, right, where 15 to 10, it's if it was going to be half, it would be 7.5. And okay, fine, but why are we boosting this one? Because you boost the price for pregnancy. A 60-year-old, especially in the ancient world, menopause had long since happened.
Right.
So why is there these two discrepancies? Now, his argument is only tackling this particular idea, but notice what he's saying is that because women can have can have children during that time, the overall category is increased. But it doesn't matter whether that particular woman can have children. So if a woman happens to be infertile, she doesn't get 5 shekels off. That's not supposed to be a percentage. She doesn't get 5 shekels off because she's infertile. It's still the standard 30. I mean, he's saying as a category, there is a potential. And the category potential is all we care about. We don't care about the individual because they're not horses and donkeys. Right? A horse or donkey, you'd absolutely want to know whether the horse or donkey was infertile before you bought it. Because chances are you don't want to buy an infertile donkey or fertile donkey. Maybe you want an infernal one. Unless you're going to get a huge discount because you never have the opportunity to breed it. So donkeys are mules that are infertile. Mules are the infertile ones. Yeah. Okay, just checking. Okay, so let's go on it because I'm going to turn off this ringer because it's getting quite annoying.
But look at the 60 plus. It's 15, 10.
Well,
yeah, it doesn't really make sense, does it?
No.
I mean, the woman's almost equal at that point.
Well, really, she probably should be a little bit higher.
wait,
Well, let's take a look and see what Rashi has to say about this.
Once they here you go. Once they reach old age, a woman's worth grows closer to that of a man. As the saying goes, an old man is trouble, but an old woman is a treasure.
That's my point.
No one's ever heard that old saying before?
No.
Right. Well, no. I mean, but what's that?
I say I'm outraged now.
Yeah. Now you can be outraged. Well, at least as far back as antiquity, there was a feeling that women were perhaps better in old age than men were. That there was all other things being equal, if they were the same age but different gender, that the woman might be more valuable to the community than the man was. Now, Bechor Shor is going to give us an explanation of why that might be the case.
Ordinarily, a man will work at his full strength. When he gets older and weaker, he cannot do as much, and so his work is less, for he never learned a lighter trade. A woman does lighter work and hence loses less of her capability as she ages.
Right? So she drops by 2/3. He is dropping by well over that, right? Because his strength was for a particular type of work, which now he can't do. And he doesn't have another way to contribute to the community because he never learned how to do things that didn't require that kind of manual effort. And again, we're talking about agrarian societies in the past here. Whereas a woman would have, yes, had some heavy duty labor work. And trust me, the women of the old were stronger than most average men are today because of the work that they had to do in the fields and with the animals and all of that. But on average, still, the average work that a woman did in antiquity required less physical strength than the average work of a man. And many of their particular skills were of types that could continue even when they lost their physical strength. And that meant that they were simply more productive for a longer period of their time, right? So what we're seeing here is actually an economic map of the average productivity of an individual, and at least potential productivity, sorry, not of an individual, but of the category. And what it's implying is that for men, there is a arc that goes something like that. Hold on, let's imagine he continues to live like that. But for women, there's an arc that goes something like this. That it's a flatter curve, right? Yeah, she doesn't spike because she's not able to be out there doing all of the huge bailing work that he's doing and all of the other animal wrestling work that he's doing, but she continues in a way that is very different than the way he diminishes. Right? He waxes and wanes. She is more constant. And as a matter of fact, historically, anthropologically, this is an overall accurate depiction of many pre-industrial societies, where men are often the ones who will bring back sporadic large gains, but women were the ones who would continue the long-term stable gains. In most pre-agrarian societies that were hunter-gatherers, the men would hunt, and many days they'd come back with nothing. But the women were the ones gathering the berries, gathering the roots, grinding the grains. They were keeping the calories, at least at a low level, steady. And then the man would, boom, every now and then bring back the big catch, would bring back the big spike of benefit to the community. And that seems to be quite reflected in how this valuation is being carried out. Question, comment?
The attribute of strength. That's a gift of God. It's one of the qualities God gives each of us in different measure. And so that is being reflected in this chart.
Potentially, except God gives it to us in different measures individually.
Right.
This is saying, I don't care if the woman is stronger than the average man or the man is weaker than the average woman. This is saying it's not about you as an individual. It is about simply the built-in structure for the average person within this community, because the Torah, as we already saw at the beginning, does not want to get into the micro-valuation of each individual person. Remember, you were all kind of uneasy with the idea that the death of the very wealthy person would be somehow worth more than the death of a very poor person. Now, American law says that is absolutely true. That is how American laws for damages work. Is the wealth and earning potential of a person absolutely figures into the court decision. This says, no, not exactly. Now, yes, it does figure into some other types of decisions. If you do injure a person, there are other ways that the earning potential matters. But as far as God is concerned, when you're making a declaration of a vow, God does not care how capable each of these people are. God sees them just as a potential within the society. As an average or typical member of that person, which Rambam is going to drive home even more in the Mishnah Torah.
Whether a person pledges the worth of an attractive, healthy person or one who is ugly and ill, he must give the fixed amount specified by the Torah according to the age of that person. This applies even if the person has zara, is blind, an amputee, or possesses any type of blemish.
Right? You can have the least, in quote, valuable member of the community, the blind Mitzora, the leper, who is also, an amputee, and they're going to be worth exactly the same as the paragon lord of the manor, who is the most beautiful, handsome, and wealthy person in the community when it comes to making this vow. And then he tries to give our distinction that we're looking for here.
Pledges for a person's valuation are not like those for worth. When a person says, I am responsible for my valuation, or I am responsible for that person's valuation, he must pay the valuation of that person as if he were a servant sold in the marketplace, whether it be a dinar or 1,000 dinar. Even if the person is a minor 1 day old, a tumtum, and androgynous, or a non-Jew.
Even if they fall into a category not normally covered by this chart, you would, if you wanted to pledge the value of a person in the marketplace, you can do that. But if you want to pledge the value or the worth of a person, trying to make the English fit how this is talking, then that is going to fall on the chart. Right? So there is a value, there is a price tag. And Rambam understands that because he's familiar with the idea of people being bought and sold in a marketplace. But then there's also a worth, and the worth doesn't change depending upon the idiosyncratic characteristics of the individual. Make sense? Okay, but what about how this works? I mean, are we? Who do we use as our benchmark? Who can even join in this process? And the Sifra, one of the earliest collections of Midrashim, is going to try and clarify from a close reading of the text.
Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, a man, if he utter a vow in your valuation of souls to the Lord. The children of Israel assess, but Gentiles do not assess.
So what this is trying to say, and we have to always bear with the Midrash. The Midrash always used far fewer words than we would like. It's just, it was written to be memorized. It wasn't written to be an entire encyclopedia entry. So what it means is that a person who is Jewish can do the vow, right? But a person who's not Jewish cannot make this vow. Right? They can do other vows and dedications in the Mishkan or temple, and non-Jews did regularly bring valuation, not this valuation, but would bring other vows to the temple. But this particular vow, because it begins a praise, speak to the children of Israel, is saying to make the vow, you have to be Jewish. We got that? Okay. However,
I might think then that they are not assessed.
Meaning, I might think that since non-Jews can't make the vow, that they also cannot be the benchmark for my vow. Right? That I would have to point to a Jewish person when I said, I will pledge that person's worth. You might think that, and remember, every time the Midrash says you might think something, you would be wrong if that's what you thought, right? It always sets it up as a null hypothesis, as something that it's going to shoot down. So I might have thought that, however,
it is therefore written, a man. These are the words of Rabbi Meir.
Right? So the phrase a man means anybody, is how they're reading this.
Right.
Meaning that I can, because I'm Jewish, I can make a vow, but I can pick anybody, Jewish or non-Jewish, to be the benchmark that I'm going to use. Which means a 45-year-old man who is Jewish or non-Jewish is the same number. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? And for all the other categories as well, of course. Good?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Good question. On the next part.
Okay, so he continues.
Rabbi Meir said, if one verse includes and the other excludes, why do I say they are assessed but do not assess?
Right, so it's like, well, wait a minute, why can't I read the second half back to the front half and say they all are able to assess?
Because the power of the assessed is greater than that of the assessor.
Right, you might think that if you can be assessed, you should be able to assess, but he's actually saying, no, the power of the assessed is greater than the power of the assessee, right? That being the one who is assessed is a stronger position to be in. Because
for a deaf mute and a half-wit and a minor are assessed, but they do not or cannot assess.
right, so deaf mutes in the ancient world, as we've talked about before, were people who, because of the lack of our ability to educate them before the modern times, were people who usually did not have full mental development. They were lacking in that mental capacity, as were people who were insane for other reasons. And of course, a minor, like say a 1-month-old, is likewise not able to make a vow. Right? Even if they are 5 years old and they can say the words, it doesn't count as anything. And that is trying to point out that there are people who can be assessed who cannot make the assessment, right? Who cannot make the vow. And that is the broader category of the world, right? So anyone can be assessed. But because of the language in the introduction for this, being specifically to the children of Israel, only we were able to make this particular type of vow. Everyone got that so far? I know, it's a fine distinction. All right. Rashi's going to move on a little bit because there's different ways to make this vow that we have to clarify.
Nifashot. He expressly states that he will give to the sanctuary the valuation attached to a life by saying, the payment of the valuation of such and such a thing. That, however, being something upon which its life depends, is incumbent upon me.
All right. So what Rashi is bringing to our attention is a longer discussion in the tradition, which is what happens if someone says, "I'll make the vow of my foot," right? The value of my foot, the worth of my foot. Is there a difference between saying that and saying, "I'll make the vow for the worth of my heart"? And what the tradition says is yes, those are different. Because the text, where it says human being in our verse 2, because it actually uses the word nefashot, which is a deeper sense of like the life of a person,
Right.
it means that if you make a vow for a part of a person upon which their life depends, then you've actually made a vow for the whole person. But if you make a vow for some other piece, the pinky, the hair, or your ear, then that would be valued in the whole, what would you be worth with it? What would you be worth without it? Slave market kind of estimation. But it's trying to say that there are certain parts of a person that you can't just do the whole pound of flesh and it's all equal, which is another reason why Shakespeare got Shylock wrong. He got him wrong for lots of reasons, but the idea in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice that a pound of flesh from the heart would be the equivalent of a pound of flesh from anywhere else, no, that's not true, right? Judaism would absolutely consider a pound of flesh taken from your hip to be much less important than a pound of flesh taken out of the center of your chest. Good? Good. Now, the Seftei Chachamim is a commentary on Rashi's commentary, and it's going to try and expand on this a bit more too.
On which the soul depends. This comes to exclude a hand or a leg upon which the soul does not depend. That is, if he said, the worth of his hand or leg is incumbent upon me. It is as if he said nothing, and he is absolved from making payment.
Right, because if I actually use the erech, this type of vow formula, and pointed to a leg or a hand, then I've not used the phrase correctly. And if I've not used the phrase correctly, then it just doesn't matter, right? It was an empty statement. It's a null sentence. We talked about the null hypothesis. Here is a null statement, which Rashbam will explain a little bit more for us, why it matters what you say.
He will set aside. The word means something similar to the word mifarash, in the sense of spelling out details. Anyone making a vow has to clearly define what he is vowing to do.
The sages were very, very adamant that vows were not meant
Right.
to just be saying, I vow to blah, blah, blah. To take a quick example, to only eat sandwiches, right? Well, what do you mean? I mean, do you mean you're only going to eat sandwiches for lunch? Do you only going to eat certain types of sandwiches? What counts as a sandwich, right? Is falafel a sandwich because it's, in between the halves of a pita? Or do you mean only sandwich in the European classic sense of sandwich? You have to be clear of what you mean. And because if you are taking upon yourself an obligation to God, then the details matter. It can't just be a generic statement, because fulfilling a vow is absolutely important and breaking a vow is absolutely wrong. And therefore, we need to know where the line is between fulfillment and failure to fulfill. So it's almost like the words you say matter. I know. What a revelation. But hopefully you've noticed that we've seen that in multiple parts of the Torah, as well as all of Jewish law, that what you say, how you say it, when you say it, where you say it, these things all matter. And that should be something that is with us all the time. Now, just for a little bit of a difference, we're going to finish off with an extended bit of commentary from Rabbeinu Bachya, who is going to bring in some interesting sort of surface level discussions, and then we're going to go a little mystical by the end. So just to make sure your hands and feet are inside the vehicle at all times.
Basically speaking, the term erek describes a valuation in monetary terms. When somebody, for instance, promises to give to the temple treasury the equivalent of a certain vital part of his body, such as the head or the heart, he has to pay to the temple treasury the amount fixed in Torah for his entire body, seeing that he would not be able to continue living if he lacked the part of the body he had donated or sanctified for the temple treasury.
All right, so we begin with a nice little summary. that he's bringing us of what we've already sort of learned from Jewish law, right? That if you make it, this is all about making a donation of money. So even though I say I value, or I make a donation, and I make a vow in the worth of myself, that doesn't mean they're going to put me on the altar, right? I'm not going to be chopped up and served for a sacrifice. It means I'm going to be handing over some cash, which is why the Torah uses cash. And if I happen to mention a part of me that is a life-sustaining part, then what I actually meant was the whole of me. And the value would be as our chart has. So far, pretty much what we've already covered. Onward.
A midrashic approach based on Tankuma
Bechukotai.
The term according to the valuation of living beings. The Torah portrays God as saying that if you donate to me the monetary equivalent of your person, I will account it for you as if you had donated to me your lives, your soul.
All right, so why does it use the term nefashot? Why does it use that particular phrase for a person's life? Because there are other ways to describe the life of a person. It's to say that this is as though you donated your soul. That yes, you're only giving up a certain cash amount, but God considers it, and so should you, that when you make this particular form of vow, that you are trying to explicitly be talking about the life of a person, the soul of a person. And this is what God is seeing as your dedication. Now, we've just seen in this two little paragraphs a wonderful example of how you can have what's called a pashat explanation, meaning a surface level explanation of what's going on in the text. And then you can move to a drash, a midrashic explanation of what's going on in the text. Now notice they're sort of working parallel to each other. They're not contradicting each other, but if you were to cover up the midrash, you'd still be able to apply the law perfectly fine. And if you cover up the law and only read the midrash, you wouldn't be able to apply the law, but you would be getting the same message just fine. And it would be, in fact, an enhanced bit of information that if you only focused on the law, you might not understand the feeling that goes along with it. So they work very much together. They're complementary. We're good? Mm-hmm. All right. And now we're going to go into the Kabbalah. Now, the Kabbalah is a general term, although some people try to trademark it and use it for their own marketing schemes. But the Kabbalah is a general term for received mystical insights. Now, mystical insights are always trying to relate to something that is not normally understood or connected to through the regular course of study or experience. That is what mysticism means. And the Kabbalah is sort of the catch-all term for Jewish mysticism. We good? All right, so this is where it's going to get deep.
A Kabbalistic approach. I believe that the addition of the letter Kaf is an allusion to the Kisei Hakavod.
Okay, hold on, wait, what? Okay,
where's the Kaf?
Where's the Kaf? We got to get our Kaf out of the way first. All right, so verse 2, right, where we're talking to everyone that someone wants to make a vow, the erkecha. So our word for this whole vow program is erech. It's the third line before the end of the verse 2, or the third word before the end of verse 2, right? So the question is, why is there a bonus kaf at the end of that word? Erkecha. Right, what is the cha that is going along here to this word? Now, cha at the end of a word usually is a a possessive pronomial suffix, meaning that it is your something or other. But that doesn't make sense here, because it's not talking about your valuation. It's talking about the valuation of the nefashot, of the lives, the souls that we are talking about. So the insertion of that kaf seems out of place. And you'll in fact notice that most translations totally ignore that kaf. They don't try to translate it at all. It's almost as though it were extraneous. But of course, anything that is extraneous has to therefore be hinting at something that is not extraneous. Even if it's not there for the simple translation, even if it's not there for the interpretation of the law, it must be interpreted in some way that can bring us insight and meaning. But notice from what I just pointed out, it is not going to be interpreted in a way that upends the interpretation of the law. It's not going to be interpreted in a way that upends the other meaning we've already discussed. It's going to be interpreted in a way that provides perpendicular meaning that seems to be a very different insight from this topic. It's almost like we're looking through this into a whole new world rather than to the actual topic at hand. You understand? Everyone understand what I mean?
That explains why Fox's translation reads in a very strange way.
It's a little clunky. Well, how does he?
He says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, any man, when he would make a vow offering in your assessed equivalent of persons to the Lord."
Right. So they're putting the your assessed into to try and explain
Your
the
assessed
kaf.
equivalent.
Right.
So
To explain the kaf, they twisted the grammar to make the word your fit into it. But that's not the usual way that it's translated, and it's not the way, as you can see, even our tradition translates that assessment. Because remember, there is no your assessment here. The assessment is preset along the chart. Okay, so now we've got the idea of this extra kaf. And remember, kaf has, I'm going to need to erase some of this. Kaf has two forms. There is the regular kaf, and then there is the final form of kaf when it's written at the end of a word in Hebrew. So the regular form of a kaf looks like that, kind of like a backward C. And then the final form of a kaf looks like that, where that's the line. So the line of the final kaf drops below the line of the text being written on. Everyone understand that distinction? So when we get the kaf in the commentary that we just read, that looks like this one. That's because this is the way it shows up in our text, because it's at the end of the word erkecha. But when we get to the word kisei hakavod, God's throne of glory, it's at the start of the word, and so it's going to look like that one. But it's the same letter. It's just drawn in two different ways. Think about like uppercase and lowercase English letters. An uppercase B and a lowercase b, still the same letter. Nothing happened between them. They just look different depending upon where they are in a word. And that's all that's happening here. It's just English doesn't have final forms of letters, and so it seems weird, but it's not. English has beginning forms under special circumstances, which also seems weird because Hebrew doesn't have those. So every language has its own little quirks. Okay, so now we've got kisei hakavod, the idea of God's glorious throne, God's throne of glory. So go ahead and pick up from God's throne.
God's throne of the attribute of glory, which is perceived as shaped somewhat similar to the letter kaf, a letter which strives in an upward direction, as if asking God to take his seat upon it.
All right, so they are almost anthropomorphizing the letter. And indeed, in the extended version, they go even further to that. So it's striving upwards. It's like one of the longest vertical lines you can get in the Hebrew alphabet. And of course, it creates a lovely little seat at the top. We see how they're visualizing this? Right? Remember, this is what I said. It doesn't change any of the halakha, doesn't change any of the other meaning of this, but it is looking into a small idiosyncrasy in the text to leverage that into all sorts of other insights. Okay, so now we've got this kaf hoping to be a seat.
So concerning these appearances of the letters of the alphabet, Rabbi Akiva said that the letter kaf stood in front of the Lord and said, "I wish that you will employ me when creating the universe, seeing that they call me your throne, your crown, your pseudonyms." In response to this, the word, which was it? Kisei was based on the letter
Kaf.
Kaf.
Okay, so again, this is anthropomorphizing the letter as it is saying, God, they will look at me and they will think of you, so use me as you create the universe, right? So essentially what he's saying is Kabbalistically is the letter had the insight to the eventuality of humans' understanding of the world by how they would react to the shape of its letter. And therefore the Kaf said it would therefore be appropriate to use me in a way that fits with the way people look at it. We're talking about a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. The Kaf is saying human beings are going to look at me and they're going to think up and sit. And if they're already thinking that, use me to reflect that. And that way, when they think up and sit and it's linked to you, their intuition and my word will work together and people will be closer to understanding you. Right? So it's not that God created, this is what's so unusual about this and interesting, it's not that God created the kaf to give us that insight, it's that the letter already begs for that particular way of looking at it, and therefore God created the word to go with that natural shape. It's almost as though this is trying to say that the universe was created in a way that our own natural intuitive psychology and association and all the ways we look at the world could, with the right guidance, lead us in the right direction. And God took advantage of that in how he designed the world around us. Right? Rather than us fighting against the world, we actually were, the world was designed to work with us, not against us. Right? And there's not like misleading elements within it. Okay, I know it's a little strange, but we're going to get to more of what this means, and we'll back away from the icon.
It is well known that the root of the spiritual soul originates in or at the throne of God. And when the Torah writes here, according to the value of the souls, this is an allusion to the value of the throne of God, as if the Torah had written that the person donating his value had in mind the value of his soul as evaluated by God's throne. In other words, the souls are perceived as supporting the throne as part of the concept called Merkava.
Merkava is the word for chariot, which is usually referring to the vision of Ezekiel and his vision of God being held aloft by these different angels, or God's throne being held aloft by these different angels. So let's unpack this last paragraph, because it had a lot going on in it. So the idea that the soul comes from the throne of God, it goes back to many different teachings in the Midrash and Talmud, where it says that God keeps the souls of the world under his throne. Now, that's not just saying, like, it's the remote control stuck under your sofa cushions. It's trying to say that this is where the souls of human beings dwell. Right? That's how close we are to God. That is what God used to shape the world, that we are essential to God's glory. We are essential to God's kingship. And therefore, our soul and God's throne, we're linked together. But what he's trying to say here, and this is where it adds from the Midrash that he already brought, is it's not just saying when I say, use this value as though it were myself. It's trying to say, use this value as though it were myself, and I understand that myself is one of the supporting elements of God's throne. Because a lot of people think of themselves as, being either worthless or worth more. A lot of people think of themselves as being important or unimportant. And a lot of people, of course, are focused just on, do I get to go on living tomorrow? And, that's kind of important to me. And that's my main goal in life. But what this is trying to tell us is that because of that link to the soul from the throne, that when you are offering up your soul, you are offering up something that is of absolute incalculable worth, regardless of who you are. Because remember, it doesn't really matter who you are. It's just going to follow a particular pattern. You are absolutely essential for the support of God's throne. And when you are willing to offer up that is much more valuable than just, me, Joe Schmo. It's me, Joe Schmo, one of the pillars of the universe, one of the pillars of holding up God's throne of glory. That's my ultimate worth. And that is what he is saying you should be reflecting on when you read through this passage of the Torah, which otherwise looks a little strange and is perhaps hard to immediately apply to our own modern circumstance. And yes, we don't do these vows anymore, but we are still worth what we were always worth. We are still one of those essential elements holding up God's throne.
In the service at the Mishkan and later in the temple, the Levites who were required to sing, for example, were generally between what ages and what ages?
They were usually in that 20 to 60 range. Yeah, that's the average range of able-bodied.
So, yeah, that would be the age and the likely gender of those who are closest to the.
Well, yes, but everybody,
service.
right? But
everybody participates in it, and everybody's present.
Well, and everybody is valued, and they may have a different shekel value,
but
every soul
is
coming from that same source.
So everybody is, even with the same source, everybody has a slightly different role within.
Of course, yeah. We all have a different role and different contribution to give.
And also at different times that shifts.
Which is why the chart also shifts. But the ultimate truth that all of the souls come from that same source, and that all of the souls have more value to them in how they reflect their support of God's throne than just for their own, limited existence, is something that hopefully can get us to look beyond just our own limited existence. It's nice, and yes, to be alive, Judaism celebrates this. This is great, and to be me. Yes, I'm very happy I'm me and I'm here. But I need to think about the fact that my existence reflects more than just me in my own, limited understanding. That I represent something much greater than that. At least if I'm thinking about it more deeply, I can realize that. And that's why the Kabbalah tries to give us this insight on, like I said, this otherwise complicated, odd financial vow system. We good?
Mhm.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.